We've talked about the complexity of human outcomes that we're trying to measure constructs. We've talked about how you can measure attitudes, knowledge, behavior, and results when we're trying to understand human outcomes. We've talked about the importance of writing reliable and valid surveys. The next thing we're going to talk about is the importance of choosing the best type of question for your construct. Essentially, there's a lot of different question types you can use on a survey, and you just want to make sure that the type of question or item that you use aligns with whatever it is that you're trying to measure. And I'll show you what I mean by that. We're going to talk about six popular question types: open-ended questions, dichotomous questions, categorical questions, multiple response questions, ranking questions, and Likert type questions. So let's begin by talking about open-ended questions. Open-ended questions allow the respondent to write whatever they want. So, how do you feel about your job? And just write me a paragraph. Open-ended questions are great in that they provide a lot of very thorough information. That's where we're getting the deepest information is from written responses. The problem with open-ended questions is that they're really difficult to analyze. And we have this quantification issue where we want to understand stuff in bulk and aggregate. We want a snapshot of the entire organization. And it's really hard to take qualitative responses and break them down into a way that's easy to understand on a broad level. And that's why we often use quantification, is it's just a lot easier to analyze quantitative results as opposed to qualitative ones. Open-ended questions are usually the best way to assess knowledge. So earlier in the lecture, I talked about how I aced that welding test, even though I didn't know anything about welding. The only reason I was able to do that was because it's a multiple choice test. If that had been a open-ended question where they asked me to write an essay about welding, I couldn't have done it, right? I wouldn't have even had the vocabulary with which to do it. And so if you're trying to assess knowledge, the best way to do it is almost always open-ended questions. But it's just really time consuming to go through those. And that's why we often fall back on multiple choice. So open-ended questions are the first type of question. Dichotomous questions are when you're choosing between two things. So dichotomous variables are variables with only two categories. There's not a lot of examples of this. Living and dead, I think, is a pretty straightforward example of this. You're either one or the other. Not a lot of gray area there. We used to use gender as this example, as the go-to example, but we don't measure gender in that way anymore. Pregnancy is dichotomous, right? You're either pregnant or not. You'll also hear these called binary variables. There's a special type of dichotomous variable called forced choice. You may have seen these on hiring tests. So forced choice is when I give you two options and you got to tell me which one you are. So I'll say, which adjective best describes you, organized or disorganized? The problem with this is that pretty much anyone knows that if you're taking a test for like a job application, that organizations tend to like organized people as opposed to disorganized people. So you can just say, obviously I'm organized. Forced choice is when they provide you with two positive adjectives. So which are you, organized or personable? Now, both of those things are good. The person who wrote the survey did research to find out which one is most closely related or more important for success in this position. But because they're both positive, it makes it more difficult to fake an answer to it. So that's why you'll see forced choice questions sometimes. The next type of question we'll talk about is categorical. Categorical responses allow people to place themselves into categories. The most common example of this is demographics, so ethnicity, what else? Ethnicity, religion, political party. All of those things would be categories, and that would be categorical responses. You also see people doing stuff like this sometimes, where on a survey they'll ask you how old you are or how much you earn, and then they'll break these down into different categories. So you're taking what is really a continuous variable and turning it into a categorical variable. I think the reason they do this is because they want to respect the privacy of the people who are filling out the survey, and we might be hesitant to disclose our actual age or our actual salary and we're less hesitant to kind of put ourselves into categories. Avoid doing this unless you absolutely have to. You're losing a lot of really important information here. There's a meaningful difference, for example, between someone who makes $27,000 a year and $49,000 a year, but the way this is set up, they'd be put into the same category, and you're losing all that nuance when you collapse it down into categories. So avoid doing this. I mean, if you absolutely have to for privacy reasons, you can do that. If you are going to do it, I would strongly recommend that you keep the categories equal, that if one is 10 years, they're all 10-year gaps. If one's $50,000 gap, they're all $50,000 gaps. It's really important for statistical analysis to make sure that the groups are the same. All right, the next type of question we'll talk about is multiple response. Multiple response is when you see something like this. How do you feel about your job? Please check all that apply, and you can check as few or as many as you would like. The only reason I mention these is just don't ever use them. I have no idea why people use these. They're impossible to analyze statistically. They give you less information than open-ended questions. Avoid these. All right, next type is ranking or ranked choice. So with ranked choice, you're forced to put things from the best to the worst. A lot of companies, these were like really popular in the 90s for performance management, and they would just rank all the employees and then fire the bottom like 5% like every quarter. It's a very stressful work environment to be in. But the reason they pivoted to ranked choice is because supervisors have to work with the people they supervise every day. They don't want to upset them. And so you get inflated ratings where it's like, oh, these are these 3 people. They're all 5 out of 5. They're all doing great. If we're using the data to differentiate between successful and struggling employees, this is not useful data. We use data to differentiate. Data like these don't help us differentiate because everyone's the same. So in forced choice, in rank, you have to rank people. Okay, I guess this guy's the best, the woman's slightly behind him, and then the kid is slightly behind her. And so now this gives us differentiation, and it allows us to say, okay, even though their performance is similar, who has the best performance? One of the main problems with ranking is that you lose a lot of information. So using the same example, maybe this dude is great at his job and this woman's great at her job, and there's just like such a slight difference between them, and it's a really hard call who should be first and who should be second. But this kid, man, this kid sucks at his job. It's obvious to everyone. But when you just look at the rankings, you don't see, none of that information is communicated in the ranking. So first and second and third, it's just the same drop, which might not be what's going on in real life. All right, and the next item type we'll talk about is Likert. So Likert is obviously like one of the most popular item response options that you'll see. I use them in the online modules every week. In Likert responses, people are asked to respond on a spectrum, usually from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and or from like not very confident to very confident, stuff like that. Most people use 1 to 5 on Likert scales, but you'll also see 1 to 7, 1 to 9. Sometimes you see even ones. It all depends on what the person who's designing the survey wants to accomplish. So Likert responses are basically the most useful for statistical analysis, and that's why they're used so much. Let me show you what I mean. All right, so we're going to use an example of job satisfaction. I'm measuring this on a 1 to 6 scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I'm using an even scale because it will make my example easier. I could also measure this dichotomously, right? I am satisfied with my job, yes or no. The problem with measuring it dichotomously is that this happens, where I'm taking the people who responded 4, 5, and 6, and I'm putting them into a category together. I'm collapsing them all together. Now you can see from this that 3 and 4, people who responded 3 and people who responded 4, actually responded more similarly than people who responded 4 and people who responded 6. And yet I'm putting the people that responded 4 and the people that responded 6 into the same category, and I'm putting the people that responded 3 and the people that responded 4 in different categories. And so I'm losing a lot of really meaningful information when I do this. Now, because of this, when I want to statistically analyze it, if I have a Likert type question, I can compare job satisfaction to other things and see the relationship. So for example, maybe I measure job satisfaction or organizational commitment. This is on a 5-point scale. And I see that, hey, people that are low on job satisfaction tend to be low on organizational commitment. People that are high on job satisfaction tend to be high on organizational commitment. And then there's people in the middle. And using these data points, I can estimate the relationship between job satisfaction and organizational commitment. That's really important. That's really useful information. Now imagine I'd measured both of these things dichotomously. I could say, oh, are you satisfied with your job? Yes or no. Are you committed to the organization? Yes or no. There's only 4 places on this chart where I can put data. Right? People answered 1 of 4. And so when I try to fit a regression line, when I try to look at the relationship between these two constructs, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. I don't know, because I really only have those 4 different data points. So whenever possible, measure, try and use Likert instead of dichotomous variables, whenever possible. There are problems with Likert responses too. There are a lot of problems with Likert responses. I'm not going to get into all of them. I'll choose my favorite pet peeve of Likert responses. Now, say I absolutely hate skiing. My parents took me skiing all the time when I was a kid, and I remember waking up at 4 in the morning in the dark, and it was freezing cold, and I just absolutely was miserable, and I hate skiing more than anything in the world. If I see this Likert response, I like skiing, I'll put a 1 there, right? Now, pretend you've never ever been skiing in your life and you're open to it. It might be fun, but I don't know. You don't know if you're going to be in love with it or not. You've just never done it before. So you would probably respond to 3 on this scale that, oh, I don't know. I neither agree nor disagree. And what you're trying to say is that you're neutral. You don't have an opinion. But when we go to analyze this data, what we're really doing is saying that you like skiing 3 times as much as I do. Which obviously isn't what you're actually trying to communicate. So the neutral on a Likert scale isn't really neutral, and I think that's one of the biggest problems with it. That being said, Likert is one of the best options we have for survey response, so I would encourage you to use it as much as possible. So those are the 6 most common survey response types: open-ended, dichotomous, categorical, multiple response, ranking, and Likert.